Hello, and today we're going to be talking about the Hart HPWD01 20V cordless wet dry vac. So let's get started. Starting off at the rear and bottom of the tool, we have the nozzle attachment for getting into crevices. And directly above that, we have one of the latches that secures the motor or the top of the vacuum to the body of the vacuum. Moving around to the side of the vacuum, we have the floor nozzle, and then directly above that, we have the blower port. And on the front, we have the second latch that secures the top to the bottom of the vacuum. And on top of the tool, we have the hose suction port, as well as the hose assembly, the on and off switch, the 20V battery port, as well as the folding handle. The wet dry vac using a 4 amp hour battery weighs right around 4,346 grams. That's about 9.5 pounds. And without the 4 amp hour battery, the vacuum weighs 3,614 grams, or almost 8 pounds. The vacuum's hose is a nice extendable hose or collapsible hose. When it's in use, you can extend it up to about 5.5 feet, and when it's not in use, it collapses down to about 2 feet in length. The hose hooks into the body via a 90-degree port, which can rotate up to about 85 degrees. Overall, I think it's a decent design. The one issue I could see happening with this port is, since it's a 90-degree bend, I can see stuff getting blocked there. I haven't had it happen to me yet, but it's something I could definitely see happening in the future. So just keep that in mind if you suddenly lose suction power, that there's probably a blockage occurring at this point. Or in the floor nozzle tool right before it goes into the hose. I have had that area get clogged up. Moving on from the suction port, we have the on and off switch. It's a nice large on and off switch, which is easy to operate even if you are wearing gloves. So it's definitely a decent on and off switch. It's slightly recessed, which means it's a little bit harder to bump, and I don't really think that's going to be an issue during operation. So overall, a decent switch. Moving on to the inside of the vac tank, we have the wet dry filter as well as the float ball assembly. The float ball assembly is a common design for keeping liquids out of the motor, and it is a decent design. Now, the filter is not a HEPA filter, however it is a wet dry filter, and it is a washable filter, and it firmly locks into place. So overall, I have to say I am a fan of the design they decided to go with for this filter system. Okay, let's talk about the weak point on this wet dry vac, and that would be the latches. Overall, I really do prefer latching designs to the other designs for keeping the tops of wet dry vacs attached to the bottom of wet dry vacs. But this particular design has a little bit of a flaw, and the flaw is that it is too weak, meaning that the latches can become undone too easily. And while this won't be a major issue when you're transporting solid debris such as dirt, dust, and that sort of stuff, it will be a much bigger deal if you are using it for liquids, because let's face it, liquids always find their way out of whatever you're carrying them in, and not having a good seal means that, well, it's going to be very easy for them to find a way out for this particular wet dry vac. So overall, I really think that the latches on this need a redesign or some modification in order for them to work properly. But with that being said, I don't think it's a deal breaker. It's just something that you need to be careful of when you are operating this tool. So with that being said, let's move on. This wet dry vac has a nice blower port, and how you operate it is you simply plug in the front of the hose into the port, and then you undo the rear of the hose from the suction port, and then you can use it as a lightweight blower. So overall, I really like this design. Another nice design choice they went with was external onboard tool storage, meaning that you don't have to carry around the tools on the inside of the tool or in a bag. So this is definitely a nice design choice. Now, the tools themselves, I probably would have changed a little bit. I would have liked to have the crevice tool maybe be a little bit narrower so you could get into tighter spots, and I would have preferred to have the floor tool be a little bit, well, longer and narrower so that it would have a little bit wider suction area and to have it narrower to improve the suction. But overall, they're still not bad, and they still do a decent job. So definitely a pro in my opinion. Now let's talk a little bit about the form factor of this wet dry vac. Now the form factor I think is about perfect. I really think that these wet dry vacs that run off of batteries that are in the 18 to 20 volt category should definitely be smaller. Now I know some people prefer having the 3-gallon tanks for the storage of the debris or dust or dirt or whatever, but me personally, I actually prefer the 2-gallon size because they're easier to transport, they're easier to hold, they're easier to put into places. I just like them better. I think it looks better, I think it works better, and that's just me personally, but for me, I really actually enjoy using this 18 volt / 20 volt wet dry vac. And the size factor, or the form factor I should say, is definitely what I personally prefer. So overall, I actually really do enjoy using this wet dry vac. While using it, I had very few issues, and considering the price point, I actually think it's actually a fairly decent little vacuum, and it does a good job of picking up different kinds of debris. It did a good job of picking up metallic things such as washers, nuts, screws, coins, and quite frankly, I've been fairly impressed. About the only issue I had while using it, other than the latches, was with the floor nozzle attachment. The floor nozzle attachment tapers down to a fairly skinny area right before it goes into the hose, and that area can be prone to clogging up with debris. So just keep that in mind. It's an easy fix, and there's a lot of shop vacs and wet dry vacs on the market that have the same issue. But that's just the nature of the beast, I guess. So overall, I've been fairly happy with how well this little wet dry vac performs. Now, the build quality of this wet dry vac is actually fairly decent. It's not going to be on the same level as a Makita or a Milwaukee, but at the same time, you're not paying those prices. Now, the biggest downside I'd probably say when it comes to the build quality would be the latches and probably the crevice tool and the floor tool. And though the two tools aren't horrible, they're just not the route or the way I would have designed them. Other than that, though, everything else feels fantastic. I mean, the hose feels like a nice quality hose. It has a pivoting inlet port, and so that's also a super useful and handy feature. And the carrying handle is nice because it folds down, locks into place, and when you unfold it, it has a nice rubberized grip, which makes it very comfortable for carrying. The power switch is nice and large, and so you can easily tap it with gloves or with your foot if you have to, and you can turn it on and off easily. The body of the vacuum is also nice and thick, and it's not going to be punctured easily, and quite frankly, everything on it feels like a decent quality tool, except for those latches, but we already covered that. So, quite frankly, I've been enjoying it, and I still think it's a decent little vacuum. And I think the average homeowner or DIYer will be perfectly happy with it, to be honest. Because I think a lot of people are like me and really like to go cordless whenever they possibly can. Okay, let's talk about what you can expect to be able to suck up with this little wet dry vac. Obviously, it'll be able to handle water in small amounts with no issue. I'd say it'll probably be able to hold about 1.5 gallons would be a safe bet. Even though it says a 2-gallon wet dry vac, you all know that that's just how the actual capacity. That's not what it can actually handle. But in the terms of the solid debris, I was able to pick up all the usual culprits, all the way up to about probably a 3-inch screw or a dollar-sized coin. So, quite frankly, it's been doing a decent little job. Now, if the debris is too large to enter the hose, obviously you won't be able to suck it up, and so some of the larger stuff that a normal shop vac would be able to handle, such as, say, paper towels or even some larger wood shavings, this probably won't be able to get the job done. But all the other usual culprits, such as small coins, small wood chippings, medium-sized wood chippings, medium-sized coins, or even larger coins. Now, I'm not recommending you use this to suck up money. I'm just using that as a weight comparison. But overall, I have to say, I think this little vacuum has plenty of power. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons of this little wet dry vac. And the first pro is size. Overall, I really do like the form factor of this wet dry vac. It's not overly large and it's not overly small. Overall, I really think that this will be handy on those trips to the beach or to the camping in the mountains. So, quite frankly, I really do think that this is a pro and something in its favor. And the second pro is design. Overall, other than the latches, everything else on this is fantastic. I really do like having the tools stored externally on board the tool itself, as well as the whole hose. And it all folds up nice and neatly, and it is all compact. Quite frankly, I think the design of this is fantastic, and I definitely think it's a pro. And the third pro is the blower port. I'm really glad that they didn't decide to go with a venting system where it uses a grate system rather than the port. The port is just useful, and it's another tool in the arsenal of keeping stuff clean. And let's face it, we all need more tools in that arsenal, so definitely a pro. I know I kind of covered this already, but I have to say this again. The onboard external tool storage is just so handy, so nice, and it's just well thought out. So overall, I definitely have to say I really do enjoy having the onboard tool storage on this wet dry vac. And another pro would be the hose. The hose is extremely nice and it will do a fantastic job. I really like the fact that you can extend it up to about 6 feet in length, and it collapses down to about 1.5 feet in length for storage on top of the tool. So overall, everything about the hose is perfect in my opinion. 18 volts, and yes, it is 18 volts. It's not actually 20 volts. If you read the fine print, it's 18 volts. So 18 volts I think is plenty of power for this little shop vac. On the other shop vac I reviewed earlier this year from Ryobi, I said 18 volts was not enough power for that particular shop vac, and for that particular shop vac it wasn't. The hose diameter was too large and too long for 18 volts to provide enough power. This particular shop vac, however, has a shorter hose that has a smaller diameter, so 18 volts is more than enough power for this to be able to handle most of the jobs that the average homeowner will be able to need to accomplish. So overall, definitely a pro in my opinion. And the first meh is not HEPA. Yes, it would have been nice to have a HEPA filter in there, but for the price you really can't expect that, and it still does a good job, and it still has a decent filter in there. So it's not a con, it just would have been nice. So it doesn't make it onto the con list, but it doesn't make it onto a pro list either. So it's just meh. And the tools are also on the meh list. They're not the best designed tools in the world, and they're not the way I would have designed them. But most people probably won't have any issues with them, and they still do a decent job. So they're not really a con, but they're not a pro either. They're just meh. And probably the first and biggest con would be the latches. The latches just are not very well tough or latched very securely. They're just too easy to undo, and quite frankly, if you're carrying liquids around and you accidentally undo one of the latches, you're going to have a mess. So quite frankly, it's definitely a con. It's not going to be a huge issue if you're dealing with dry debris, but for liquids, it's definitely a major issue. And the last con is no extension tubes. Now this is pretty common for battery operated wet dry vacs not to have extension tubes, but for me personally, I really think that all wet dry vacs should have extension tubes, period. And a minimum of 2, and probably a maximum of 3, would be nice. They just come in handy for so many different circumstances, and quite frankly, I really rely on them for a lot of different jobs. So, quite frankly, this is a con in my opinion. You can disagree with me whether or not you think this would be a con, but for me personally, it is. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this tool. Overall, I really like this tool and everything about it, except for those latches. The runtime is pretty decent, coming in at around 18 minutes to drain a 4 amp hour battery, and 16 minutes of that time is actually fairly decent power-wise. So it does a good job on the runtime. The biggest issue is the latches, and as long as you're careful, they're not technically that big of a deal, although I still think it's a big deal. It just would have been nice if they had been better designed. Everything else is good. The compactness of this is good. The tools are decent. The hose is good. The blower port's good. Everything else is good. It's just those latches. So I can't really highly recommend this, but I still can recommend this. It's definitely not a deal breaker. It's just something that you need to be aware of. I think if you're going to be working with liquids primarily with the shop vac, you might be a little bit disappointed because the capacity is so low. But at the same time, that's not really what this shop vac's primary role is. It's just, in my opinion, kind of an extra feature that is handy to have, the ability to suck up liquids. So at the end of the day, I do recommend it. I just cannot highly recommend it. And that's about it. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. God bless.